The motel room reeked of cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. I sat on the thin mattress, the black hefty bag open beside me. My daughter Danny had thrown it at my chest 3 hours ago. Take your garbage and disappear. XI unfolded the worn blue passbook. First Midwest Bank. Balance $700,000. A yellow sticky note in Donnie's handwriting. Dad, he forged your signature. I have proof. Play along until I call. One click on subscribe and a comment with your city helps more than you know. Thank you for watching. My name is Mitch Cavanaugh, 62 years old. Licensed general contractor, state of Illinois, since 1987. I'd been sitting on that motel bed for 3 hours, ever since Danny threw the bag at my chest, staring at her note. The words blurred and sharpened. Forged your signature. Play along. The highway noise filtered through thin walls. Trucks downshifting on Route 59. The heater rattled against November cold. I folded the passbook closed and pressed it between my palms. $700,000. My daughter's handwriting, the smell of cigarette smoke that no amount of industrial cleaner could mask. How did I get here? The question pulled me backward through the years, past Greg's smooth handshakes and expensive whiskey, past Martha's hospital room and the machines that beeped her final hours, past 4 decades of sawdust and blueprints and honest work, back 45 years. Back to Chicago, 1979. I was 17 years old, hired as a carpenter's apprentice by Frank Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who built half the bungalows in Bridgeport. He had hands like baseball mitts and opinions about everything. The sawdust got in everything. My clothes, my hair, my coffee. You want to know if a man is honest? Frank asked me on my first day. Watch how he measures. I didn't understand then. I learned. Frank taught me that a 1/4-inch error in framing becomes a 1/2-inch gap in drywall. A 1/2-inch gap becomes a callback becomes a reputation. He made me measure everything twice, 3 times, until precision lived in my hands. By 25, I was running crews. By 30, I had my own contractor's license and a reputation for careful work. Over the next 3 decades, I built or renovated 212 homes in Chicago's western suburbs. DuPage County, Will County, parts of Kane. I knew every inspector, every permit office, every notary who handled construction documents. That last part would matter later, but I didn't know it yet. I met Martha at a church fundraiser in 1985. She was helping serve casseroles, wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes, laughing at something another volunteer said. I watched her for 20 minutes before working up the nerve to introduce myself. What do you do? She asked. I build houses. She smiled. That's honest work. 6 months later, I stood at the altar watching her walk toward me in white. Martha taught 3rd grade at Jefferson Elementary. She had a gift for patience that I lacked, a way of seeing the best in people before anything else. She made friends everywhere. The grocery clerk, the mail carrier, the woman who ran the dry cleaners on Washington Street. In 1988, we bought a lot in Naperville. 3/4 of an acre, good drainage, mature oak trees along the back property line. I spent 2 weeks drawing plans at our kitchen table. Martha looked over my shoulder and pointed at the corner of the living room. I want a window there, she said, big enough to watch birds. I drew it in. Building that house took 3 years. I did most of the work myself, hiring help only for the heavy lifting and the specialized trades. Every oak banister was hand-carved, every electrical connection personally wired. I laid the wraparound porch with flagstone I hauled from a quarry in Joliet. The day we moved in, Martha stood in the living room and cried. Happy tears. That's what she called them. This is ours, Mitch. You built this with your own hands. We lived there for 35 years. Danny was born in 1990, the year we finished the house. She grew up there, learned to walk on floors I'd sanded smooth, scraped her knees on the flagstone porch. When she was 8, she asked to help me build a birdhouse. I let her hammer the nails. Most of them went in crooked. That's okay, I told her. We'll straighten them out. She married young, at 22, to a boy named Tyler who worked in insurance. The marriage lasted 4 years. After the divorce, Danny went back to school, earned her accounting degree, specialized in forensic work. Fraud investigation. She was good at it, she said. Numbers didn't lie. Meanwhile, I developed a habit that Martha called my second family, ham radio. I set up a station in the basement, spent evenings talking to people across the world, Australia, Japan, Norway, Brazil. I kept a logbook of every contact, recording call signs, locations, frequencies, weather conditions. The discipline appealed to me, the precision. Last October, I made contact with a researcher at McMurdo Station in Antarctica. His call sign was KC4AA, Dr. Paul Hendricks. We talked for 45 minutes about radio propagation over polar regions. He was studying penguin migration patterns. I told him about the birdhouse Danny and I built when she was 8. I logged that conversation with exact timestamps. Both of us did. That's what ham operators do. 2 years ago, Martha was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctor delivered the news in a beige office with motivational posters on the walls. Stage 3. Aggressive. Treatment options limited. Martha squeezed my hand and said, "Well, we'd better get started then." I took her to every appointment, held her hand through chemotherapy, watched the woman I'd loved for 37 years fade like morning frost under hard sun. She lost weight, lost hair, lost the strength to walk from the bedroom to her bird-watching window. In the end, I carried her. She died on a Tuesday in March. I sat beside her bed for 3 hours after, holding her hand, not ready to let go, not ready to call the hospice nurse, not ready for the house to become just a house. Tuesdays became Thursdays. I forgot to eat. The phone rang and I let it ring. I stopped taking contracting jobs, stopped returning calls. I spent hours in the basement talking to strangers on the radio, people who didn't know Martha was gone, who treated me like the same man I'd been before. That was the state Greg found me in. Danny had been dating him for 3 months before she brought him to dinner. Real estate attorney, she said. Very successful. I think you'll like him. Greg Thornberry was 38, tall, gym-fit, with the kind of handshake that held a half second too long. He wore suits that cost more than my first truck. His watch was too flashy for someone visiting a contractor's home. He brought a bottle of whiskey that first night, something Japanese with a name I couldn't pronounce. "This is incredible," he said, looking around the living room. "You built this yourself?" "Every board," I told him. He asked questions about the construction, the framing techniques, the hand-carved banisters. He seemed genuinely interested, and I found myself talking for an hour, longer than I'd talked to anyone since Martha's funeral. He started visiting more often, always with whiskey, always with questions. "How's Danny doing? How are you holding up? Have you thought about what happens to the house eventually?" I should have heard that last question differently, but grief had dulled my instincts. The wedding was small. October, a year after Martha's death. We held it in the backyard, under the oak trees that had grown from saplings to shade the entire property. I walked Danny down the flagstone path I'd laid with my own hands, and I gave her away to a man I thought would take care of her. Greg's vows were polished. His smile was perfect. His eyes moved across the property, lingered on the lot lines, counted the windows. In her final weeks, Martha had moments of clarity between the morphine haze. I was sitting beside her bed when she grabbed my wrist with unexpected strength. "That man," she whispered. "What man?" "Greg." Her eyes were sharp, focused. "There's something wrong with his eyes. The way he looks at this house." "Martha, he's marrying Danny. He loves her." She shook her head. "Promise me you'll be careful." I promised. Then I dismissed her words as medication talking. Now, in this motel room that smelled of cigarettes and regret, I understood. Martha saw him clearly. Martha always saw people clearly, and I'd been too deep in grief to listen. I looked at Donnie's note again. "He forged your signature." "I have proof." My daughter, the forensic accountant, the woman who'd spent a decade investigating fraud, who knew how criminals thought, how they covered their tracks, how they got caught. What had she seen? What had she found? I pressed my palms against my knees and stared at the stained carpet. The burner phone sat at the bottom of the trash bag. I pulled it out, turned it over in my hands. A track phone, prepaid, the kind you buy with cash at Walmart. 3 contacts programmed in. Danny, someone named Frank D., a number with no name. I didn't call, not yet. First, I needed to understand what Greg had taken. I would need to get documents from Danny. But before that, I needed to figure out how to take it back. 45 years of reviewing contracts and permits had taught me to spot inconsistencies. I turned the passbook over in my hands, studying the account number, the deposit history, the balance that didn't belong to me. $700,000. My daughter's warning, and somewhere in this mess, a forged signature with my name on it. After the wedding, Greg started visiting alone. The first time, he showed up on a Saturday morning with a bottle of whiskey, Yamazaki. The label was Japanese, the price probably 3 figures. Thought you could use some company, he said. I let him in. The same table, the same chairs, everything the same except Martha. He poured 2 fingers into glasses I'd bought at a hardware store 30 years ago. He asked about the house, how the furnace was holding up, whether the roof needed attention. Professional concern, I told myself. A son-in-law looking out for family. I've been thinking about your situation, he said after the second pour. You're 62. This house is worth a lot of money now. Have you thought about what happens to all this when you're gone? I hadn't. Thinking about the future meant accepting that Martha wouldn't be in it. There are things we should probably set up, Greg continued. Tax optimization, estate planning. Protect your assets for Danny. That made sense. Greg was a real estate attorney. This was his area. I can draw up some paperwork, he said. Nothing complicated. Just standard stuff to make sure everything passes to Danny smoothly when the time comes. I nodded. Okay, he smiled. That smile that never quite reached his eyes. The documents arrived 2 weeks later. A stack of papers in a manila envelope dropped off by a courier while I was in the basement talking to a ham operator in Portugal. Greg had flagged the signature lines with yellow sticky tabs. 7 of them. The words swam on the page. I'd read 1,000 contracts in my life. That morning I couldn't focus past the first sentence. My hands shook when I held the papers. Martha's name was still on our joint bank accounts. Her voice still played on our answering machine. Reading legal documents about what happened after I died felt like digging my own grave. I signed where Greg pointed. All 7 pages. He collected the documents with that same smile. This protects everything for Danny, he assured me. You're doing the right thing. The pattern continued. Every few weeks, Greg would call. More paperwork to review. More signature lines to initial. Always framed as protecting the estate, optimizing taxes, ensuring Danny's inheritance. His office was on the 14th floor of a LaSalle Street building downtown. Glass and chrome. An espresso machine that probably cost more than my first truck. Framed diplomas on the walls. A conference table that could seat 12. I felt out of place there. My work boots on the polished floor. My flannel shirt among the suits passing in the hallway. Just sign here, and here, and here. Greg would tap each yellow flag with a manicured fingernail. I'll explain the technical parts. He explained them slowly, carefully. This clause protects against probate complications. He paused. Probate is the legal process. Another pause. When someone dies, tap, tap on the page. The court oversees distribution. I know what probate is. Of course you do. He'd smile. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. I signed, and signed, and signed again. Somewhere during those 18 months, I stopped reading entirely. The documents blurred together. Legal language I used to parse with a contractor's precision became noise. Grief had stolen something from me, some essential sharpness I'd relied on my whole professional life. 3 months into the signing sessions, I went to a dinner party at Greg and Danny's house. Their home in Oak Brook, 3 times the size of the Craftsman I built with my own hands. Greg's real estate colleagues filled the dining room. Men in expensive watches, women in designer dresses, crystal glasses clinking. Deals murmured between bites. I stood near the bar nursing a beer, listening. Greg was holding court near the fireplace, gesturing with a rocks glass. The other day, I'm explaining tax liens to my father-in-law. He laughed. Mitch is a great guy, don't get me wrong. 40 years building houses, he knows his way around a nail gun. But you start talking depreciation schedules, and his eyes just glaze over. Classic handyman, you know? The men around him chuckled. I set my beer down and walked to the kitchen. Danny was there, arranging appetizers on a tray. Dad. She looked up, surprised. I didn't hear you come in. Just needed some water. She studied my face. Her eyes dropped to the appetizer tray. She rearranged 3 crackers that didn't need rearranging. He gets carried away sometimes, she said quietly. You know how he is with his work friends. I knew. I just hadn't wanted to see it. After that night, Danny started canceling our dinners. Sorry, Dad, can't make Tuesday. Work emergency. Rain check on Sunday? Greg has a thing. Maybe next week? When I called, her phone went to voicemail. When I texted, she responded hours later with brief apologies. I drove to their house one afternoon, unannounced, rang the doorbell like a stranger. Greg answered. His tie was loosened, sleeves rolled up. Behind him, I could hear voices. Other people. Mitch. He filled the doorway. What a surprise. Is Danny home? She's resting. Headache. The drive from Naperville probably wore her out. I drove 20 minutes. Still, he smiled. You know how it is at her age. Working so hard at that accounting firm. She needs her rest. I stood on the porch of a house my daughter lived in, and I couldn't get past her husband. I'll tell her you stopped by, Greg said. The door closed. Edna Patterson told me all of this later, after the motel, after the trash bag. At the time, I had no idea she was watching. Edna had lived across the street from my house in Naperville for 35 years. She was 78, widowed, sharp-eyed. We'd been neighbors since I laid the first foundation stone. Edna watched everything from her porch. She watched Greg arrive with his leather briefcase. Watched him stand too close to me on my own doorstep, documents in hand. Watched him lean over me at the kitchen table through the window, pointing at signature lines while I hunched in my chair. She told me later what she'd seen. How Greg's body language changed when he thought no one was looking. How he loomed. How I shrank. I was worried about you, Edna said, but I didn't know what to say. He's your son-in-law. What was I supposed to do? March over and tell you your daughter's husband looked like a bully? The answer was yes, but she didn't know that then. Neither did I. What none of us knew, what I wouldn't learn until that motel room with the trash bag, was that Danny had already started fighting back. It began with carelessness. Greg left documents on his home office desk one night, papers he should have locked away. Danny found them while he was at a late meeting. Property transfer documents. Her father's signature at the bottom. She recognized something wrong immediately. The signature was too clean, too smooth. When her father signed his name, there was a slight tremor in the downstroke of the M, a wavering in the final flourish. A remnant from a minor stroke scare 3 years earlier. This signature had no tremor. It was perfect, too perfect. Danny was a forensic accountant. She'd spent a decade investigating fraud, tracing money through shell companies, identifying forged documents. She knew what a trace signature looked like. She photographed the document with her phone. Her hands were steady. They hadn't shaken since she found the first forged signature. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it. And she began to watch. For 6 months, Danny performed 2 roles. By day, she was Greg's devoted wife, attentive at dinner parties, supportive of his career, the perfect partner for an ambitious attorney. By night, she was something else. She accessed Greg's files while he slept, photographed bank statements, property records, correspondence. Built an evidence folder in a cloud account Greg didn't know existed. She tracked patterns in his income, expenses that didn't match his legitimate earnings, a lifestyle funded by something other than legal fees. She opened a savings account at First Midwest Bank, her own account, in her name only. Each week, she withdrew cash from their joint accounts. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger alerts or raise questions. 500 here, 800 there. She liquidated her retirement investments, converted everything to untraceable cash. Her retirement, her savings, cash withdrawn over months in careful increments. Danny found Frank DeLuca, a retired FBI agent who'd spent 30 years investigating white-collar crime. 64 years old. He'd served with my brother in Vietnam, though I hadn't seen him in decades. They met at his office in Bridgeport. Burnt coffee and old paper, commendations on every wall. Frank spread Danny's evidence across his desk. The forged signatures, the property transfers, the financial records that didn't add up. "I've seen this before," he told her. "Your husband has a pattern." 2 other victims I can identify, both elderly, both with property Greg helped transfer. "He got away with it?" Danny asked. "They didn't have the evidence." "You do." Together, they built a plan. 6 months of patience. 6 months of Danny pretending she didn't know. 6 months of watching her father sign away his life while she prepared to take it back. The trash bag, the passbook, the burner phone, all of it was Danny. I didn't know any of this while it was happening. I only knew that my daughter had become distant, that my son-in-law treated me like a simpleton, that documents kept appearing and I kept signing them without reading. Grief had made me careless. Trust had made me blind. But somewhere in Oak Brook, my daughter was building a case against her own husband. And somewhere in Bridgeport, a retired FBI agent was mapping the crimes of a man who thought he was untouchable. All of this I learned later. In that motel room, I only knew the weight of $700,000 and a daughter's warning. The knock came at 7 in the morning. November cold had frosted the windows overnight. I'd been standing at the kitchen sink, holding a coffee mug Martha gave me 15 years ago, watching steam curl toward the ceiling. The radiator ticked against the chill. Outside, weak winter sun fought through gray clouds. 3 hard knocks, official knocks. The kind that don't wait. I set down the mug and walked to the front door. The floorboards creaked in the familiar pattern I'd memorized over 35 years. Second board from the wall, then the third, then the threshold I'd replaced in 1994 after a pipe burst. Greg stood on my porch. Behind him, a Cook County Sheriff's deputy in a brown uniform, breath misting in the November air. The deputy held a manila folder. "Good morning, Mitch," Greg said. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than my monthly pension. The fabric didn't wrinkle in the cold. His Rolex caught the pale morning light, throwing a small flare across the porch rail I'd sanded smooth by hand. "What is this?" The deputy stepped forward. "Mr. Cavanaugh, I have a notice of eviction." He opened the folder and held out papers. "This property was legally transferred 18 months ago. You have 45 minutes to collect your personal belongings and vacate." I didn't take the papers. The words didn't connect to anything real. "Transferred," I said. Greg smiled. "The documents you signed, Mitch. Remember? Estate planning. Tax optimization. You transferred ownership to Danny and me. It's all been recorded at the county." The cold seeped through the doorframe. I stood in my flannel shirt and work boots, looking at papers that said my home wasn't mine. "I built this house." "I know. It's a shame you couldn't keep up with it." Greg's smile didn't waver. "But the title's clear. Has been for over a year now." The deputy shifted his weight. "Sir, I need you to acknowledge receipt of this notice." I took the papers. The letterhead was official. The stamps were real. My signature sat at the bottom of page 3, neat and clean, exactly the way I'd signed documents in Greg's office for 18 months. Except, I never signed this. I never signed away my home. 45 minutes, the deputy said. I'll wait out here. Greg stepped past me into the living room. He looked around at the oak banisters I'd carved, the fireplace Martha and I sat beside every winter evening, the window where she watched birds until she couldn't get out of bed anymore. I always appreciated the craftsmanship in here, he said. Real attention to detail. Of course, the place needs updating. Modern systems, you know. He ran his hand along the doorframe. Beyond what a handyman can manage these days. The word landed like a slap. Handyman. 45 years of licensed contracting. 212 homes. Every inspection passed first try. I turned away from him and walked to the bedroom. The closet held work shirts, flannels, 2 pairs of jeans. I pulled a suitcase from the top shelf and started folding clothes inside. My hands moved on their own. Shirt, jeans, the heavy wool sweater Martha knitted the winter before she got sick. The framed photo of her from our wedding day, the one that sat on my nightstand since the funeral. The nightstand drawer held $43. I'd been meaning to go to the bank. From the living room, I heard Greg's voice. He was on the phone talking to someone about the property, square footage, lot lines, potential buyers. I closed the suitcase. The basement stairs creaked the same way they'd creaked for 3 decades. My ham radio station filled one corner. $15,000 in equipment. The logbooks sat in a neat stack beside the transceiver. Leather-bound. Every contact recorded since 1992. I couldn't take the equipment. Too heavy. Too much. I grabbed the logbooks. All 8 of them. When I came back upstairs, Greg was standing on the front porch, arms crossed, the Rolex visible below his cuff. He'd positioned himself where the neighbors could see, and they were watching. Edna Patterson stood on her porch across the street, 78 years old, wrapped in a heavy coat, her breath making small clouds. She'd lived there since before I built this house. She'd watched me lay every foundation stone. 3 doors down, Tom Hendricks had come out in his bathrobe. The Chins were at their window. Mrs. Kowalski stood at the edge of her driveway, one hand pressed to her mouth. My neighbors, my community, watching me get thrown out of my own home. Greg raised his voice. Mitch, I want you to know there's no hard feelings. He said it loud enough to carry. Some people just aren't equipped to handle modern property management. Nothing wrong with that. Homes need people who can actually maintain them. Beyond a handyman's skills, you know how these old-timers are. I walked past him to my truck. The suitcase went in the bed. The logbooks on the passenger seat. $40 in my pocket. 62 years old. Standing on the curb outside a house I built with my own hands. A car pulled up. Danny's Honda, the silver one Greg bought her last year. She got out and walked toward me. Her face was set, unreadable, the girl who'd helped me build a crooked birdhouse long gone. Greg smiled from the porch. Good timing, sweetheart. Danny stopped 3 feet from me. She was carrying a black hefty bag, the kind you use for garbage. Take your trash, she said. Her voice was loud, theatrical, and disappear. She threw the bag at my chest. I caught it reflexively. You're not my father anymore. The last word broke, pitched too high. Neighbors could hear every word. You were never there when Mom was dying. Too busy talking to strangers on your radio. Too busy feeling sorry for yourself. The words cut deeper than the cold. Even knowing something was wrong, even feeling the weight of that bag in my hands, the words hurt. Danny, don't. She stepped back. Just go. Greg turned to wave at Edna Patterson. His smile was triumphant. Sorry about the commotion, Mrs. Patterson. Family matters. You know how it is. Edna didn't wave back. Her hand pressed to her chest, eyes fixed on Donnie. In that moment, while Greg's back was turned, while the neighbors watched the spectacle he'd orchestrated, Danny looked at me. Her lips moved, no sound. I'm sorry. Then her face hardened again and she walked past me to the porch, where Greg put his arm around her shoulders. I got in my truck. The engine turned over on the first try. The heater rattled against the cold. In the rearview mirror, I watched my house shrink. The porch I'd laid, the windows I'd framed, the oak trees that had grown from saplings to shade the entire lot. Gone. I drove. Route 59 blurred past the windows. Strip malls, gas stations, fast food restaurants with their parking lots half empty. The radio played something I didn't hear. The Best Value Inn appeared on the right, a two-story box of brown siding and exterior corridors. The sign advertised rooms for $49. It was past 9 when I pulled into the parking lot. The clerk was young, maybe 20. She didn't ask questions when I paid cash for one night. Just handed over a plastic key card and pointed toward the stairs. Room 27, second floor, end of the hall. The room smelled of stale smoke that no amount of cleaner could mask. A thin mattress on a metal frame. A heater that rattled against the wall. Highway noise through windows that didn't seal properly. I sat on the bed. The black trash bag sat beside me. Hours passed. The light through the window shifted from morning gray to afternoon pale to evening dark. The heater cycled on and off. Trucks downshifted on Route 59. Someone walked past my door, keys jingling, and kept going. I didn't move. Everything I'd built, 45 years of work. Martha's home. The banisters I carved and the floors I sanded, and the window where she watched birds until she died. Gone. Signed away on documents I couldn't remember reading. Stolen by a man in a $3,000 suit who called me Handyman. The trash bag sat next to me on the thin mattress. Take your garbage and disappear. I pulled the bag open. Inside, crumpled papers. A phone. A worn blue passbook, the kind banks stopped issuing years ago. I unfolded the passbook. First Midwest Bank. The balance was written in neat handwriting. $700,000. A yellow sticky note was pressed to the first page. Danny's handwriting. I'd know it anywhere from decades of birthday cards and grocery lists and the note she'd left on my windshield the day she got her driver's license. Dad, he forged your signature. I have proof. Play along until I call. The money is clean. My savings, not his. I love you. One more time, Dad. I read it twice. He forged your signature. I have proof. The papers in the bag were copies. Property transfer documents with certain lines highlighted in yellow. Bank statements with transactions circled. A timeline written in Donnie's precise accounting hand, dates and dollar amounts and cross-references. And, at the bottom of the bag, a phone. A track phone prepaid, the kind you buy with cash. 3 contacts programmed in. Danny, Frank D., a number with no name. I looked at the documents again. The signature on page 3 of the property transfer. Mitch Cavanaugh, in what looked like my handwriting. Except, it wasn't. 45 years of signing contracts and permits and inspection forms. I knew my own signature. The slight tremor in the downstroke of the M, the flourish at the end, that never quite closed. Remnants of the mini-stroke 3 years ago that left no other trace. This signature was too clean, too perfect. No tremor, no variation. Someone had traced it. Someone who didn't know about the stroke. The room was different now. The cigarette smell, the rattling heater, the thin mattress, and the highway noise. None of it mattered. My daughter hadn't betrayed me. She'd saved me. I held the passbook and the note and the documents that proved what Greg had done. $700,000. 6 months of Danny's careful work. A plan I never knew existed. Outside, trucks rumbled past on Route 59. Inside room 27 of the Best Value Inn, I sat on the edge of a $49 bed and read my daughter's note for the 3rd time. One more time, Dad. Something broke loose. Or maybe clicked into place. I turned on the burner phone. 3 contacts. Danny, Frank D., a number with no name. I pressed call. The burner phone connected on the 2nd ring. A voice I didn't recognize. Male, older, careful. Mr. Cavanaugh? Yes, my name is Frank DeLuca. Danny gave you this number. She said you'd call when the time came. I looked at the documents spread across the motel bed. The signature, that wasn't mine. The notarization stamp dated October 15th. The time came. I'll be there in 2 hours. He arrived in 90 minutes. A knock at the door, 3 short raps, and when I opened it, Frank DeLuca stood in the corridor holding 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder tucked under his arm. 64 years old, silver hair cropped close, the build of a man who'd stayed active long past retirement. His handshake was firm but not aggressive. Frank DeLuca, your brother Jim and I served together in Vietnam. I worked FBI white-collar crimes for 30 years after that. Danny contacted me 6 months ago. He handed me one of the coffees and walked past me into the room, taking in the documents on the bed, the ham radio logbooks stacked on the nightstand, the cheap furniture and cigarette-stained walls. Nice place, $49 a night. Frank set his folder on the small desk and pulled the chair around to face the bed. Let's see what you've got. Frank picked up the property transfer first. I handed him the bank statements. Papers covered the bed, the desk, the nightstand. Show me your signature, he said. I pointed to the line at the bottom of page 3. That's supposed to be mine. He studied it for a long moment. His eyes moved from the signature to my face and back. Sign your name on this. He handed me a hotel notepad and a pen. I wrote my name the way I'd written it 10,000 times. Mitch Cavanaugh. The slight tremor in the downstroke of the M, the flourish at the end that never quite closed. Frank held the notepad next to the property transfer document. The forged signature was perfect. Clean lines, smooth curves. The M had no tremor. The final flourish completed in a single confident stroke. The stroke left that tremor, small enough that most people don't notice. Frank nodded. But someone tracing your signature from old documents wouldn't know about it. It's too smooth. Frank set both papers down. That's your first piece of evidence. A forensic document examiner will confirm what we can see with our eyes. That signature was traced, not written. He picked up the notarization page next. The stamp showed Kyle Benson's notary seal, his commission number, and the date, October 15th. The same date I'd already noticed in the motel room, studying Danny's evidence. Tell me about this date, Frank said. I reached for my ham radio logbooks. 8 leather-bound volumes recording every contact I'd made since 1992. I flipped to the 3rd volume, found October of last year, ran my finger down the entries. October 15th. I read the entry aloud. Contact with Casey Ferrier, Dr. Paul Hendricks, McMurdo Station, Antarctica. Began at 1847 hours. Ended at 1932 hours. Signal strength 4. Conditions clear. Discussion of radio propagation over polar regions. Frank looked at me. You were in your basement talking to Antarctica for 45 minutes. Both logs recorded it. His end and mine, with timestamps. And this notarization stamp says you were in Greg's office signing documents. I was never in Greg's office that day. Frank pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and dialed. Someone answered on the 3rd ring. Martinez, I need a favor. Kyle Benson, Notary Public, Cook County. Hold his commission records and any travel documentation for October 15th of last year. I'll wait. He put the phone on speaker and set it on the desk. While we waited, I organized the documents Danny had included in the trash bag. Bank statements showing Greg's account balances. Credit card records with purchases highlighted. A timeline written in Donnie's precise handwriting. Frank picked up the timeline. Your daughter's good at this. She's a forensic accountant. I know. That's how she found me. She came to my office 6 months ago with preliminary evidence, said her husband was stealing from her father, but she needed help proving it. Martinez's voice came through the phone speaker. Got it, Frank. Kyle Benson, Notary Commission, issued 2019. On October 15th of last year, his records show he registered for the Illinois Real Estate Law Conference in St. Louis. Hotel confirmation at the Marriott downtown. 3-day conference, October 14th through 16th. Frank looked at me. The notary was in St. Louis. He couldn't have witnessed any signature in Chicago. Frank thanked Martinez and ended the call. He leaned back in the chair and folded his hands. Let me tell you what I've found over the past 6 months. Greg Thornberry has done this before. 2 other victims I've identified so far, both elderly, both widowed, both signed over property to Greg's clients under circumstances they couldn't later explain. He pulled photographs from his manila folder, an older man in a Veterans Administration cap, a woman with white hair and kind eyes. Harold Simmons, 81. His wife died of Alzheimer's in 2019. Within a year, he'd signed documents transferring his house to a development company Greg represented. By the time Harold realized what happened, the property had been sold and the money laundered through shell companies. And the woman? Eleanor Patterson, 76. Similar story. Husband died, Greg appeared, documents were signed, property vanished. She contacted police, but they said it was a civil matter. She didn't have the evidence to prove criminal fraud. But we do. Frank gestured at the documents covering the bed, the desk, the nightstand. You have the evidence they didn't. A forged signature with provable discrepancies. A notarization stamp that's physically impossible given the notary's documented location. And 6 months of financial records your daughter compiled showing Greg's lifestyle far exceeds his legitimate income. The burner phone buzzed. A text from Danny, sending more files. Check the email account. Frank opened his laptop and logged into the email address Danny had set up for our communication. The inbox held 6 new messages, each with attachments. I leaned in. Screenshots of Greg's bank accounts filled the screen. Credit card statements showing purchases. The Rolex. The condo deposit. The ice molds. All documented. Monthly payments totaling more than his reported income could support. Restaurant charges at places where a single meal cost more than my motel room for a week. None of this matches his reported income, Frank said. Your son-in-law is spending money he's not earning legitimately. He's spending money he stole from people like Harold and Eleanor, and you. Frank closed the laptop and looked at me. There's someone I want you to meet. Rebecca Marsh, Assistant District Attorney for Cook County. She specializes in elder fraud cases. Her grandmother was swindled by a financial advisor 15 years ago. She takes these cases personally. Can you trust her? I worked with her on 3 prosecutions before I retired. She's the best. He made the call. The next morning, Rebecca Marsh arrived. 45 years old, dark hair pulled back, wearing a gray suit that said government attorney, but carrying herself like someone who'd forgotten more about courtroom combat than most lawyers ever learned. She shook my hand in the motel doorway. Mr. Cavanaugh, Frank says you have something I need to see. For the next 3 hours, we walked her through everything. The property transfer with my forged signature. The notarization stamp dated October 15th. My ham radio log proving I was in my basement talking to Antarctica. Kyle Benson's conference registration proving he was in St. Louis. Rebecca examined each document with the intensity of a surgeon studying an X-ray. She asked questions. Precise questions. When did you notice the signature discrepancy? Can you verify the ham radio contact with Dr. Hendricks independently? Does the notary have any connection to Greg beyond these documents? Frank provided the answer she needed. Harold Simmons, Eleanor Patterson, the pattern of elderly victims. Greg's financial records showing unexplained income. When we finished, Rebecca sat back in her chair and looked at the documents spread across every surface of my motel room. Coffee cups had accumulated on the nightstand, papers taped to the mirror. The smell of fast food containers from meals we'd eaten without leaving. I've prosecuted 43 elder fraud cases, she said. This one has everything. What happens now? I asked. Rebecca pulled out her phone. I'm going to get warrants for Greg's arrest on charges of forgery, filing false documents, theft by deception, and financial exploitation of an elderly person under the Illinois Elder Abuse Act. For Kyle Benson on notary fraud charges. She looked at Frank. Can you get Benson to cooperate? He's facing his own prison time if he doesn't. I'll make sure he understands his options. Rebecca stood and gathered her notes. Mr. Cavanaugh, I need you to understand something. This case is strong, but it's not over. We have evidence, but evidence needs to survive defense attorneys. Greg will have good lawyers. They'll attack the signature analysis, the notarization claims, your credibility. I've signed my name the same way for 50 years. I know what my handwriting looks like. She nodded. That's exactly what I need to hear. She extended her hand. I'll be in touch within 48 hours with a timeline. In the meantime, stay here. Don't contact Greg or your daughter through any channels he might monitor. And don't let anyone know where you are. After she left, Frank and I sat in silence for a long moment. The motel room had transformed over the past day. What started as exile had become something else. Yesterday morning, I said, I was garbage thrown onto the street. Frank looked at the documents, the evidence of a crime dismantled by a contractor's eye and an agent's training. And now I had the evidence to take everything back. Frank Kowalski's voice came back to me across 45 years. You want to know if a man is honest. Watch how he measures. Greg had measured wrong, and I'd spent a lifetime learning precision. 3 weeks after the eviction, I stood across the street from my own house, watching Greg pour drinks for strangers in my living room. December cold should have cut through my jacket. It didn't register. Frank DeLuca stood beside me in the shadows between two parked cars, his breath making small clouds in the evening air. Nice party, not for long. Through the windows, I could see figures moving, cocktail glasses catching the light. Greg had strung holiday lights along the porch rail I'd built with my own hands. Red and green bulbs wrapped around the columns I'd turned on a lathe in 1989. His guests were real estate colleagues, men in expensive suits, women in cocktail dresses. The kind of people Greg wanted to impress. The kind of people he'd called me handyman in front of. Kyle Benson, the notary who stamped documents he never witnessed, turned this morning, Frank said. Full cooperation. He's giving up everything. I nodded. We'd expected that. Kyle was 32 years old with a notary commission he'd worked 3 years to get. Facing criminal charges for fraud, he'd folded within hours of his arrest. What did he say? Frank checked his watch. That Greg paid him $2,000 to notarize documents he never witnessed. That this wasn't the first time. That there are at least 4 other properties with the same arrangement. 4 others. Harold Simmons, Eleanor Patterson. 2 more names Kyle gave up this morning. Same pattern. Elderly widowers. Forged signatures. Property transfers that happened on paper but never in person. A car pulled up behind us. No headlights. I recognized the silhouette of a D.A. Rebecca Marsh in the driver's seat. 2 other vehicles followed, parking along the curb. Sheriff's deputies. Rebecca got out and walked to where Frank and I stood. She wore a dark coat over her gray suit. Her face was all business. Mr. Cavanaugh. She handed me a folded paper. Arrest warrant, signed by Judge Morrison 2 hours ago. I looked at the document in my hands. Greg Thornberry's name, a list of charges that filled half the page. Forgery, filing false documents. Theft by deception, financial exploitation of an elderly person under the Illinois Elder Abuse Act. 45 years of signing contracts and permits and inspection forms. I knew what legal documents looked like. This one was real. Another car pulled up. The door opened and Danny stepped out. She walked toward us without hurrying. Her face was different from 3 weeks ago when she'd thrown that trash bag at my chest. The performance was over. What I saw now was something harder. Professional. Dad. Danny. We stood there for a moment, the word hanging between us. Then she held up a manila folder thick with documents. 6 months of evidence, she said. Every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer, every dollar he stole. I looked at my daughter, the girl who'd helped me build a crooked birdhouse at 8 years old, the woman who'd spent 6 months pretending to hate me while building a case against her own husband. Thank you. She nodded once. Let's finish this. Rebecca Marsh checked her watch. Deputies, with me, Mr. Cavanaugh, you and your daughter will follow. Stay behind us until we've made the arrest. We crossed the street in a group. The Christmas lights on my porch cast red and green shadows across the lawn I'd seeded 35 years ago. Through the window, I could see Greg holding court near the fireplace, gesturing with a rocks glass, telling some story that made his colleagues laugh. Rebecca climbed the porch steps I'd built. The deputies flanked her. She rang the doorbell. The sound carried through the door. I heard the party noise dim as someone moved to answer. Greg opened the door. He was wearing a charcoal suit, different from the one he'd worn during the eviction, but just as expensive. His Rolex caught the porch light. His smile was the practiced warmth of a host greeting late guests. The smile froze when he saw Rebecca's badge. Greg Thornberry. She held his gaze. I'm Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Marsh. Behind Greg, the party had gone silent. I could see his colleagues through the doorway, cocktails suspended, faces turned toward the commotion. You're under arrest for forgery, filing false documents, theft by deception, and financial exploitation of an elderly person under the Illinois Elder Abuse Act. Greg's expressions cycled through stages. Confusion first, his brow furrowing as the words registered. Then, recognition as he saw me standing behind the deputies. Then the color draining from his face as understanding hit. A bead of sweat formed on his upper lip. This is Riddick. He stopped, swallowed. You can't just come in here and make accusations. I stepped forward. The deputies let me pass. The signature wasn't mine, Greg. He stared at me, his mouth open, but nothing came out. I've signed my name the same way for 50 years, I said. The same trimmer in the downstroke, the same flourish at the end. You traced it from old documents, but you didn't know about the stroke scare. Your copy was too clean. That's not. He stepped back. You signed those papers. I was there, and that notary stamp dated October 15th. I let the question hang for a moment. Kyle was in St. Louis that day. Conference hotel records. Close. His own notary logs. He couldn't have witnessed any signature in Chicago because he was 200 miles away. Greg's eyes darted to the side, looking for escape. There was none. Deputies blocked the doorway. His colleagues watched from the living room like spectators at a car accident. Danny stepped onto the porch. The folder of evidence was in her hands. I'm a forensic accountant, Greg. Her voice carried clearly enough for everyone inside to hear. What did you think I did all day? His face went white. Danny, what are you talking about? We're married. You're my wife. I found the documents on your desk, she said. 6 months ago, your forged copy of my father's signature, the property transfer you filed without his knowledge. I've been building this case ever since. You've been, Greg's voice trailed off. He looked from Danny to me, to the deputies, to Rebecca Marsh. The calculation in his eyes was visible. The attorney's mind searching for an angle, a defense, some way to talk his way out. There was no angle, no defense. 6 months of evidence. 3 witnesses who would testify. A notary who'd already turned state's witness. Turn around, please, Rebecca said. Hands behind your back. You don't understand, Greg said. His voice had changed, the smooth confidence cracking. Mitch signed those papers willingly. He didn't read them. That's not my fault. He's old. He was confused. Mr. Thornberry. Rebecca's voice cut through his excuses. Turn around. The deputies moved forward. Greg's shoulders slumped. He turned slowly, placing his hands behind his back. The deputy clicked the handcuffs into place, the sound carrying in the cold December air. Through the doorway, I could see his colleagues watching. The men in expensive suits who'd laughed at his jokes about the handyman. The women in cocktail dresses who'd admired his taste in Japanese whiskey. All of them frozen, drinks in hand, watching their host get arrested in front of the craftsman details he'd claimed to appreciate. The deputies led Greg down the porch steps. His $3,000 suit wrinkled as they guided him toward the squad car. His Rolex caught the Christmas lights one last time, red and green reflections flashing across the crystal face. Across the street, a figure stood on a porch. Edna Patterson, 78 years old. She'd been standing in that same spot 3 weeks ago when they threw me out. When Danny hurled the trash bag at my chest. When Greg smiled triumphantly from my own doorway. Now, she watched from that same position as deputies put him in the back of a squad car. She raised her hand. No smile, just acknowledgement. The neighbors had come out again. Tom Hendricks in his winter coat. The Chens at their front window. Mrs. Kowalski at the edge of her driveway, one hand pressed to her mouth, same as 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, they'd watched my humiliation. Now they watched his. Rebecca Marsh approached me on the porch. She checked her phone. The State Bar complaint goes live at midnight. Assets frozen by noon. Between the criminal charges and the civil proceedings, he'll lose everything. I looked at my house. The windows I'd framed. The door I'd hung. The Christmas lights someone else had wrapped around columns I'd turned by hand. And the property? The fraudulent transfer will be voided, Rebecca said. Your attorney can file for title restoration as soon as the arrest is processed. Given the evidence, I don't expect any complications. Danny stood beside me. She was looking at the house too. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for what I had to do. The things I said, I know. It was the only way. If Greg suspected anything, he would have hidden the evidence, destroyed the documents. We needed him confident. We needed him careless. I understood. 6 months of pretending to hate me. 6 months of canceled dinners and unanswered calls. 6 months of watching her father get evicted from his own home while she built the case that would bring him down. You did what you had to do. She nodded. The professional mask slipped for a moment, and I saw my daughter underneath, the girl who'd helped me hammer crooked nails into a birdhouse, the woman who'd inherited her mother's instincts about people. Mom was right about him, Danny said. She knew. Martha always knew. The squad car pulled away from the curb. Through the rear window, I could see Greg's profile, his head bowed, his expensive suit wrinkled around the handcuffs. The party guests were filing out now, grabbing coats, avoiding eye contact with the deputies still on scene. Their phones were out. By morning, everyone in Chicago real estate would know what happened here tonight. Frank DeLuca appeared beside me. His breath made small clouds in the cold. Harold Simmons called this afternoon, he said. When he heard about the arrest, he cried on the phone for 10 minutes, said he'd given up hope of ever getting justice. I watched the taillights of the squad car disappear around the corner. How many others? Frank shook his head. Kyle's still talking. Could be more than we know. The last of the guests drove away. The house stood empty now. Christmas lights blinking on a porch no one deserved to stand on except the man who'd built it. Rebecca Marsh handed me a business card. Call my office tomorrow. We'll coordinate with your civil attorney on the property restoration. Thank you. She walked to her car, heels clicking on the driveway I'd poured in 1990. I raised my hand toward Edna Patterson across the street. She raised hers back. 3 weeks ago, she'd watched them throw me out. Tonight, she'd watched them take him away. The same witnesses, the same porches, the same house, different ending. I looked at Donnie. Let's go inside. She had a key. Greg's key, copied months ago as part of her investigation. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. The living room smelled of expensive cologne and spilled whiskey. Abandoned cocktail glasses sat on surfaces I'd finished by hand. Someone had left a plate of appetizers on the coffee table Martha bought at an estate sale in 1993. I walked to the window where she used to watch birds. The frame was still solid. The glass was still clear. Someone had moved her chair. I moved it back. Danny stood in the doorway watching me. Tomorrow, we'd file paperwork. Tomorrow, the legal process would begin. Tomorrow, I'd start reclaiming what was stolen. But tonight, I stood in the house I'd built with my own hands, looking out the window my wife had asked for, listening to the silence of justice done. Greg got sloppy, I said. Danny stepped forward and put her hand on my shoulder. You taught me to measure twice, she said. Through the window, I could see Edna Patterson finally going back inside. The street was quiet now. The Christmas lights blinked red and green on columns I'd turned 35 years ago. Frank Kowalski's voice came back to me one more time. You want to know if a man is honest? Watch how he measures. Greg had measured wrong, and I'd spent a lifetime learning to measure right. The trial began on a Tuesday in February. Courtroom 76 of the Richard J. Daley Center was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights that buzzed when the room went quiet, the kind of government architecture that hadn't been updated since the 1970s. I sat in the second row behind the prosecution table. Frank DeLuca was beside me, his posture straight despite his 64 years. Danny sat on my other side, a folder of documents in her lap. The bailiff called everyone to rise. Judge William Okonkwo entered through a side door, 58 years old, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who'd seen every excuse the legal system could produce. His father, I'd learned from Rebecca Marsh, had immigrated from Nigeria in 1962 and worked as a janitor in this very building for 30 years. The son had watched his father mop these floors while attorneys in expensive suits walked past without acknowledgement. Judge Okonkwo had no patience for educated men who preyed on working people. Greg sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit, different from the one he'd worn during the eviction, but the same cut, the same cost. His attorney, Marcus Webb, whispered something in his ear. Greg nodded, but his face was pale. The confidence I'd seen on my porch 3 months ago was gone. ADA Rebecca Marsh stood when the judge called the case. People v. Gregory Thornberry. Charges: forgery, filing false documents, theft by deception, financial exploitation of an elderly person. She began her opening statement, speaking for 12 minutes without notes. The defendant systematically targeted a grieving widower, she told the jury. He forged signatures on property transfer documents and stole a home worth over $600,000. The evidence will leave no doubt. Marcus Webb's opening was shorter. His client, he claimed, had merely assisted a confused elderly man with estate planning. Any discrepancies in the paperwork were clerical errors, not criminal intent. Used elderly man. I kept my face neutral. The prosecution called Kyle Benson first. Kyle was 32, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that didn't fit quite right. His notary commission had been revoked 3 weeks after his arrest. He walked to the witness stand like a man approaching his own execution. Rebecca Marsh handed him a document. "Do you recognize this?" Kyle leaned toward the microphone. His voice cracked on the first word. "Yes, that's a property transfer I notarized." "And what date does your stamp show?" "October 15th of last year." "Were you present on that date when Mitch Cavanaugh signed this document?" Kyle looked at the defense table. Greg stared straight ahead. "No, I wasn't." "Where were you on October 15th? "St. Louis. The Illinois Real Estate Law Conference at the Marriott." "So you notarized a signature you never witnessed?" "Yes." "Why?" Kyle's hands gripped the edge of the witness box. "Greg asked me to. He said it was routine. Said the old man had already signed and they just needed the stamp for the paperwork." "Did he pay you?" $2,000. Per document. "How many documents did you notarize this way for Mr. Thornberry?" 7, that I remember. Marcus Webb's cross-examination tried to establish that Kyle was lying to save himself, that he'd acted alone, that Greg had never explicitly instructed him to commit fraud. Kyle held firm. His testimony took 2 hours. Rebecca Marsh called me next. I walked to the witness stand and placed my hand on the Bible. The bailiff asked if I swore to tell the truth. "I do." "Mr. Cavanaugh," Rebecca began, "how long have you been a licensed general contractor in Illinois?" 45 years. "And in that time, how many contracts, permits, and legal documents would you estimate you've signed?" "Thousands, maybe tens of thousands." She handed me the property transfer document. "Do you recognize this signature?" I looked at my name written in ink. The lines were clean, smooth, perfect. "That's supposed to be my signature, but I didn't write it." "How can you tell?" I held up the document for the jury. "In 2021, I had a minor stroke scare. left no permanent damage except a slight tremor in my right hand. Every signature I've written since then has a small waver in the downstroke of the MI pointed to the forged signature. This is too smooth. Whoever wrote this traced it from older documents before my stroke. Objection, Marcus Webb said. The witness is not a handwriting expert. Judge Okonkwo looked at me. Mr. Cavanaugh, are you offering expert opinion on document forensics? No, Your Honor. I'm telling you what my own handwriting looks like after 50 years of writing it. Overruled. Rebecca continued. Mr. Cavanaugh, where were you on October 15th of last year when this document was allegedly signed and notarized? In my basement in Naperville, making a ham radio contact. Can you prove that? I pulled out my logbook. She'd already entered a copy into evidence, but I wanted the jury to see the original. October 15th, contact with KC4AA, Dr. Paul Hendricks at McMurdo Station, Antarctica. Began at 6:47 p.m., ended at 7:32 p.m. Both logs recorded the same timestamps. His end and mine. You were talking to Antarctica while your signature was supposedly being witnessed in downtown Chicago? Yes. Marcus Webb's cross-examination lasted an hour. He suggested my memory was faulty, that grief had confused me, that I'd signed documents willingly and simply forgotten. Mr. Cavanaugh, isn't it true that in the months after your wife's death, you were severely depressed? Yes. And during that time, didn't you sign many documents without reading them carefully? I signed documents Greg brought me. I trusted him, so you might have signed this transfer without realizing what it was. Marcus Webb waited for my response. I've reviewed permits and contracts for 45 years. I know what a property transfer looks like, and I know what my own signature looks like. That document is a forgery. You're not a forensic expert, Mr. Webb said. No, I'm the man whose signature was forged. The forensic document examiner testified next. Dr. Anita Vance, a certified graphologist from the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners. She displayed enlarged photographs of my signature on overhead screens. The jury watched as she pointed to the traced letters, the unnatural smoothness, the telltale signs of forgery. Danny took the stand that afternoon. She walked past Greg without looking at him. Her testimony was clinical, precise. 6 months of financial records, bank statements showing Greg's income versus his spending, the Rolex, the planned River North condo, the ice mold collection that costs $3,000. The math doesn't work, Danny said. His legitimate income couldn't support his lifestyle. The difference was funded by property theft. Marcus Webb asked why she hadn't reported her suspicions earlier. I needed evidence. Accusations aren't proof. I'm a forensic accountant. I know how to build a case. The next day, Rebecca Marsh called Harold Simmons, 81 years old, World War I veteran's cap on his head. He shuffled to the witness stand and described how Greg had appeared after his wife died of Alzheimer's. The friendly attorney who helped with estate planning, the documents that transferred his house to a development company. I didn't know what I was signing. He told me it was tax paperwork. Next thing I knew, my house was sold and the money was gone. Eleanor Patterson testified after Harold, 77 years old. The same story. A dead husband, a helpful attorney, a stolen home. Pattern, Rebecca Marsh told the jury. This is what predators do. They find vulnerable people and they take everything. Frank DeLuca testified about his investigation, 30 years with the FBI White-Collar Crimes Division. He explained how he identified the pattern across multiple victims, how he connected the dots between Greg's various property acquisitions. Edna Patterson was the last witness. She was 78 years old, dressed in her Sunday best, and she spoke directly to the jury. I've lived across the street from Mitch for 35 years. I watched him build that house with his own hands, and I watched that man treat him like a fool. She described the signing sessions. Greg arriving with his leather briefcase, standing too close to Mitch, looming over him at the kitchen table while documents were signed. The day they threw Mitch out, Edna continued, I was on my porch. I saw the whole thing. That woman, Danny, she threw a bag at her father and screamed at him. But when Greg turned away, she looked right at Mitch and mouthed 2 words. What words? I'm sorry. The courtroom was silent. She wasn't betraying her father. She was saving him. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. I sat in the hallway with Frank and Danny. None of us spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed. Attorneys walked past with briefcases, their heels clicking on the terrazzo floor. The bailiff appeared. They've reached a verdict. We filed back into courtroom 76. Greg stood at the defense table, Marcus Webb beside him. The jury filed in and took their seats. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Okonkwo asked. We have, Your Honor. The foreman stood, a middle-aged woman in a blue cardigan. She unfolded a piece of paper. On the charge of forgery in the 1st degree, we find the defendant guilty. Greg's shoulders dropped. On the charge of filing false documents, guilty. On the charge of theft by deception, guilty. On the charge of financial exploitation of an elderly person under the Illinois Elder Abuse Act, guilty. Guilty on all counts. My hands unclenched. I hadn't realized I'd been gripping my knees. Judge Okonkwo scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. Greg was taken into custody immediately, his bail revoked. The sentencing hearing was brief. Rebecca Marsh presented victim impact statements from Harold Simmons, Eleanor Patterson, and me. She requested the maximum sentence under the enhanced elder abuse provisions. Marcus Webb asked for leniency. His client had no prior criminal record. He was a respected attorney with community ties. Judge Okonkwo listened to both sides. Then, he looked at Greg. Mr. Thornberry, you are an officer of the court. You swore an oath to uphold the law. Instead, you used your position to prey on grieving widowers and elderly people who trusted you because of your credentials. The judge's voice was flat. Matter of fact, my father cleaned this building for 30 years. He taught me that honest work has dignity, that a man who builds something with his hands deserves respect. You called Mr. Cavanaugh a handyman. You thought that made him less than you. Judge Okonkwo leaned forward. Attorneys who abuse their professional privileges to prey on grieving widowers deserve this court's full contempt. He sentenced Greg to 12 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, permanent revocation of his law license, full restitution to all victims. I watched as deputies led Greg away in handcuffs. His expensive suit wrinkled around the restraints. His Rolex had already been seized as part of asset forfeiture. 6 months after the verdict, civil proceedings restored full ownership of my Naperville home. The fraudulent transfer was voided. The title was quieted in my name. Danny's divorce was finalized while Greg sat in prison. The marriage annulled as fraudulent from its inception. The ice mold collection sold at auction for $62. The Rolex went for $8,000, applied to restitution for Harold Simmons. The colleagues, who'd laughed at Greg's jokes about the handyman, now denied ever knowing him. His name became a cautionary tale in Chicago real estate circles. The attorney who thought he was untouchable, brought down by a contractor's signature and an amateur radio log. I drove past his old office on LaSalle Street a few weeks after sentencing. The nameplate had already been removed from the door. If you're enjoying my story, hit like and rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments. Tell me why. Thank you. The turkey came out of the oven at 2 o'clock. I pulled it onto the counter Martha had picked out 35 years ago, white tile with blue trim, and let it rest while I checked the potatoes. Danny arrived first. She carried a pie and a bottle of wine, her hair shorter than she'd worn it during the trial. Behind her came Frank DeLuca, my brother Jim's old service buddy, now something closer to family. His silver hair was freshly trimmed, and he wore a sport coat that still had the price tag crease in the sleeve. Dad. Danny set the pie down and hugged me. The kitchen smells amazing. Your mother's recipe. Frank shook my hand. Good to see you, Mitch. The doorbell rang again. I opened it to find Rebecca Marsh, the ADA who'd prosecuted Greg, holding a casserole dish like it was evidence for trial. She wore a sweater instead of her courtroom gray. "Mr. Cavanaugh." "Mitch," I said. "You earned that." She smiled. First time I'd seen her smile outside a professional setting. Edna Patterson came last, walking across the street she'd watched from for 35 years. She carried a basket of rolls and moved slower than she had a year ago, but her eyes were sharp. "I set your chair by the window," I told her. "Best view of the yard." She patted my arm. "Martha would approve." We gathered around the table. 5 places set with china Martha and I received as wedding gifts. The centerpiece was simple, 3 white candles in holders I'd turned on the lathe in 1992. I carved the turkey while Danny passed the potatoes. Frank poured wine. Rebecca and Edna talked about the weather, the mild November, the forecast for snow next week. Talk about weather, about neighbors. In my house, at my table, when the plates were full, I raised my glass. To Martha. The table went quiet. She warned me about Greg before she died. I thought it was the medication talking. I looked at Danny. I should have listened. Danny's eyes glistened. "You listened when it mattered." I looked around the table. Frank, who drove 90 minutes to a cigarette-smelling motel room with coffee and evidence folders. Rebecca, who took the case because her grandmother had been swindled and she understood. Edna, who watched from her porch and remembered what she saw. "To everyone here," I said, "you believed me when evidence was all I had." We drank. Danny set down her glass. "I'm starting my own firm, forensic accounting. The $700,000 is my seed money." I nodded. "Good." The conversation moved on. Frank told a story about Vietnam. Rebecca mentioned a new case, another elderly victim, another attorney who thought credentials made him untouchable. Edna asked about my ham radio station. "Still running," I told her. "Talked to a fellow in Norway last week." After the plates were cleared and the coffee poured, I excused myself and walked through the house. The oak banisters I'd carved, the floors I'd sanded, the window where Martha watched birds until she couldn't get out of bed. I stood at that window now. Outside, Edna's porch was empty. The street was quiet. November dusk settled over the neighborhood I'd lived in for 35 years. My father-in-law once asked what I did for a living. "I build houses," I told him. He'd nodded. "Honest work." Greg called me Handyman. He thought that made me less. He didn't understand that 45 years of honest work had taught me to recognize fraud in a signature, impossibility in a notarization stamp, lies in numbers that didn't add up. Greg counted on grief making me careless. He didn't count on 45 years of reading contracts, oak banisters, tile counters. Glass I'd measured twice before cutting. Every board measured twice. Every joint fitted true. Built to last. Martha's house. My house. Our daughter's inheritance. I turned off the kitchen light and joined my guests in the living room.